If I had to choose one story from the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran that captures the essence of the country, that captures what Iran is about, it would be the following moment in history, the following story. We are in 1981. The Islamic Revolution is at its early stages, 2 years old. The revolution took place in 1979. And Iran is in grave danger because its neighbor, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, has attacked Iran. And because Iraq, Saddam Hussein's country, is militarily superior, because it has the support from the West, God knows why, it has much better military technology. So in the beginning of the war, Iran is overwhelmed, and the Iraqi army has penetrated Iranian soil. So Iran has no international support. Most of the international community is freaked out with Iran. Only some years in 1979, there was the incident with the taking of 52 US American hostages, and their hostage lasted for 444 days. So in the eyes of the world, Iraq is the lesser of two evils. So Saddam Hussein, with the support of the West, has attacked and overwhelmed Iran. Then elements very royal to the Islamic Revolution, very royal to the leader of the country, Ayatollah Khomeini, the Revolutionary Guards and its militias, the Basids, decide to deploy the weapon that would switch the momentum of the war. And this weapon was the human wave attack. What is the human wave attack? Imagine a mass of infantry, a mass of soldiers attacking straight on enemy positions. And imagine once the first group of soldiers attack, then some 100 meters behind, there's a second group of soldiers that attacks, again, head on. They might go through mines. They might go towards fortified enemy positions. It doesn't matter. You go straight on. And the point was that most of these people, most of this infantry would die, but some would persist, again, by the sheer overwhelming number. Imagine I have intruders in my house and I have a machine gun. You could say I have a big advantage because as they enter the door, I shoot at them. But if there are 100, even if I shoot 90 of them, 10 might slip inside, or at some point I might run out of ammunition. This was a tactic that the Iranians put in operation against the Iraqis, the human wave attacks. Now, this was something like a suicide attack. This was like a kamikaze attack. And the Iraqis were overwhelmed and dispirited because they say, we can stay here forever. We're never going to kill all of them. Imagine, remember I think it was in Terminator 2, but it's typical in Terminator movies. You shoot the Terminator falls down, he's full of holes, full of blood, but he always stands up and comes towards you. Or some people have put it, it's basically like a zombie apocalypse. There's thousands and thousands of zombies. You kill them, more are coming towards your way. And the majority of these kamikaze, of modern day kamikaze, were young boys, age sometimes even as young as 12 years old, 13 years old to 16 years old. And often they didn't even have weapons. So they were literally cannon folders. They didn't have weapons, but they had priests with them, clerics. And as they would attack the enemy, they would tell them words of encouragement, like, if you die, you're going to be a martyr. You're going to be like the first martyrs of Shiite Islam. The paradise is waiting for you. And they might not have guns, but they were wearing these necklaces with a plastic key. And the idea was, this is the key to paradise. And notice, most of these young boys were volunteers. They would even escape their home and give a fake birth date so that they could enlist. So you could say, okay, we've seen this before in history. When situation gets quite desperate, armies get to desperate measures. But here's the interesting thing with the human wave tactic and why it's very telling about the nature of Iran. Within something like 2 years of the war, by 1982, so Saddam Hussein attacks in 1980. For the first 2 years, he penetrates Iranian soil. Within 2 years, the Iranians had pushed the Iraqis outside of their border, or to the original border of Iran and Iraq, to where the border was before the beginning of the war. So then Khomeini and the revolutionary guards and the decision makers in the country, which were mostly the clerics, had to take a decision. We've managed to win the defensive part of the war, so now do we pack things up and go back home and continue living our lives? No, said Khomeini, and no, agreed the revolutionary guards. We go and attack Iraq because we want to get to Karbala. Karbala is the holy city of Shiite Islam. It's the city where Imam Hussein died in the legendary incident of Ashura. It's a day of unbelievable significance for the Shia. So the idea was, we go to Karbala, and after Karbala, we go to Jerusalem. So the plan was, we're going to storm Iraq, and after Iraq, we go through Jordan, and then we go and liberate Jerusalem. If you think this as Iraq, Iran is here, Iraq is here, Karbala is in the middle of Iraq, and Jerusalem is beyond the borders of Iraq and beyond Jordan. So this was clearly a plan that was absolutely crazy. And very soon, the war with Iraq became a stalemate. Not even they didn't get to Karbala, the war was mostly around the borders. But the fact that the war was a stalemate didn't matter for Iranians, because the main goal in this war was not military victory, or the victory was not measured through tactical advancements or retreats. The goal was, as many soldiers explain it, a spiritual one. The mere fact that they would march towards Karbala, that they thought were on the way to Jerusalem, even if they were only, let's say, a couple of kilometers inside the Iraqi borders, the idea that we're going towards Karbala and we're going towards Jerusalem was enough for them, not only to continue the war, but also to continue the suicide-type attacks of human wave. Of course, the Iraqis, very soon they managed and they found ways to make these attacks less effective. But again, the point was that for many Iranians, the war was a mystical experience. The war and finding martyrdom while fighting for the holy city of Karbala was a reward in itself, was a victory in itself. And there is one particular highlight, one particular moment that is captured in one of the books that I'll recommend towards the end when I give the sources for this topic. So there's some Iranian soldiers, and they are in the trenches, and they see someone limping and crawling towards their position. And soon they realize it's someone who is injured, and then while that person comes closer, they realize it's a young kid, someone who's like 16 years old. His legs were basically destroyed, almost chopped off below the shin, to the point where he had taken off his shoes and put them around his neck so that he could crawl, because he didn't have practically legs anymore. So the soldiers were completely in horror with that. They were crying. They were trying to give courage to the kid. And the kid, the only words that it could whisper was, going to Karbala is an experience that is beyond comprehension. Going to Karbala is an experience that is beyond comprehension. So here you have a soldier, his life destroyed. But the idea is, I've just had this mystical experience. I had this spiritual moment where I gave my life where I gave my bodily integrity for the Ayatollah, but also for the Prophet, or however they would put it. And you could say this is propaganda, but the fact that this type of propaganda worked shows exactly what was the spirit of that war. So why did I mention this? It tells you something about what motivates Iran. Iran is not like any other country. Iran is not your typical dictatorship. Iran is not Iraq's Saddam Hussein or Syria's or Assad's Syria. It's a country which takes its philosophy and its ideology seriously. And this is an ideology that doesn't put at its center life or the well-being of its citizens or the flourishing or the individual. So keep this in mind when you hear discussions about Iran. Iran is a very special situation of a country. Iran would rather destroy itself and in the process its enemies, or destroy its enemies and in the process destroy itself. And it would rather perish with its ideology, with its philosophy, rather than flourish without it. And again, the fact that for 8 years they were fighting Iraq basically for nothing after the first 2 years, and they were so eager to go and die, and they saw this death as a spiritual experience, shows you something about the nature of this country. So the title today is Understanding Iran. I think this story tells a lot about Iran, but let's see also some things about the country in general. So how did Iran become an Islamic republic? The starting point is the story goes, it becomes Islamic Republic in 1979, but our story begins in 1951. We have to start from somewhere. So in 1951, a guy called Mossadegh becomes the leader of Iran. He's a populist slash nationalist slash socialist, but his big promise, his big selling point is that he would nationalize the country's oil industry. He does so, and this makes him very, very unpopular in the circles of the West, and particularly the United States, and particularly the UK. So soon, there is, within 2 years actually, by 1953, there is a coup supported by the United States and by the UK, and Mossadegh is toppled. Who comes in his way? Shah Pahlavi. Shah means king. You might have heard him as the Shah. So he was someone who ruled Iran from 53 till 79. His family were were ruling the country also in previous periods. And Shah Pahlavi had two characteristics. The one was that he was loyal to the West. He was an ally of the United States. And believe it or not, today it would sound unbelievable, an ally of Israel, friendly to Israel, actually, let's put this, friendly to Israel. And the other thing is that he was a modernizer. You probably have seen the memes on Twitter with showing women in Tehran in the 60s and the 70s, and they wear their mini skirts. So their daily life in Tehran looks a bit like a Western country. Now, at the same time, he was a very authoritarian leader. There were many people rotting in prisons. There were torture, and he wasn't a guy to be looked up to. Now, not only he wasn't a guy to be looked up to, but with his pro-Western policies, he alienated two elements, very strong elements of the population. The one was the left. Iran had a very strong communist party. Of course, it was outlawed, the Tudeh, but also a big leftist milieu. Why did they hate the Shah? Because they saw him as an imperialist pawn. They saw him as an errand boy for the imperialists, for the United States, and for Great Britain. But also, the Shah was hated by the Islamists, by the clerics, and by the radical Muslims. Why? Because of his modernizing secular agenda. So as I said, as a regime, it was authoritarian, and it became more and more unpopular. And the main person who concretized this anti-Khomeini ethos, this anti-Khomeini sentiment from the population, was actually a cleric. You might have heard him. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini. He's the person who later became Ayatollah Khomeini. So Khomeini was expelled from Iran at some point. He went to Turkey. Then he spent many years in Iraq, in a Shiite city of Najaf. And then for some months, he went to Paris. But these months in Paris coincided with an upheaval in Iran. So Khomeini became kind of the center of attention. There were constantly media, journalists around him. And at some point in 1979, after mass popular mobilizations in what became known as the Iranian Revolution, Shah leaves the country. Interestingly, he literally flies his own airplane to leave the country. And Khomeini enters an airplane and flies from Paris to Iran. And he arrives in apotheosis. That's a Greek word. I think it makes sense. It means the status of almost a god. Millions of people are waiting for him on the streets. Leftists, Islamists, progressives, secularists. He's the face of the day after the Shah, the day after for Iran. Parenthesis here, the Iranian Revolution was one of the most popular revolutions that have ever taken place. In what terms popular? In terms of what was the percentage of the population that took part in the revolution. By the way, one of the revolutions with the least percentage of the population taking part in it was the Russian Revolution. But for that, what's my Ocon talk? So Khomeini returns to Iran, and soon he becomes the most prominent force in the country. And soon he starts sidestepping everyone else. He has a very strong ally on the streets, the Revolutionary Guards. These were paramilitary groups that became one big group, and they were under the auspices of Khomeini, and soon they became basically his ground troops. Now, a key moment in Khomeini solidifying his power was an event that you've probably heard of, which was the storming of the US embassy. We are in November of 1979, so some months in the revolution. Now, the storming of the embassy was not directed by Khomeini, but when he found out about it, he didn't condemn it. And it's almost certain that it was orchestrated by the Revolutionary Guards. So protesters literally reached the embassy with buses, and the buses led them there, and then there started the protest. So it was almost a state-sponsored storming of the embassy, and very soon a Khomeini-sanctioned storming of the embassy. And 52 Americans were held hostages for 444 days. 444 days. Now, this is a whole other topic that we could have a whole episode about the hostage situation. And even the way that this hostage situation was resolved was also embarrassing for the United States. A good film about that is ARCUK with, what's the name of the guy who was dating Ben Affleck? Sorry, Ben Affleck. It's a good film. So why did Khomeini sanction this move? Why did he want to enrage the Americans? The answer is simple. Khomeini wanted to have the credential within Iran that I am the most anti-Western person here. Don't hear the communists who tell you that they are the real anti-Westerners. I am the real anti-Western. And how am I going to prove it? I've held hostage the personnel of the US embassy. So there was this internal struggle on who would be more anti-American, Khomeini or the leftists. So soon the leftists find themselves in prison or shot or hanging from lampposts, and Khomeini solidifies his power. And Iran becomes an Islamic theocracy. Again, in an Islamic theocracy, obviously, the standard is not human flourishing. The standard is how you give yourself and how you become subservient to religious rule. I'll give just one example to understand what type of ideology we're talking about. Women in Iran were brought up with a story that if you listen to music, which by the way is a sin, if you listen to music, your punishment in the afterlife is throwing melted iron in your ears. Now, imagine growing up with this image. I mean, even the image is... So this was the ideology in Iran. Then also the war with Iraq begins, but this again helps Khomeini solidify his power that we're in a siege situation. So we have this dual power almost in Iran. You could think it as a dual power, but not both sides have the same amount of power. On the one hand, you have the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, and when he died these days, Ayatollah Khamenei. And on the other side, the revolutionary guards. You have the spiritual leader, the supreme leader, Khomeini back then, and his ground troops. You have the ideologue, and you have the thugs on the ground who are doing the dirty work. Does it remind you something? Does it remind you Ayn Rand's formulation of Attila and the witch doctor? Actually, opposite. The witch doctor, Khomeini, the supreme leader, the ideologue, the mystic who gives the marching orders, who gives the troops a justification for the lives they're going to take or their own lives that they're going to give, and the ground troops who have a free reign in doing atrocities, in giving their life even for these ideas that are expressed by the supreme leader, the witch doctor and the Attila. To understand it better, read Ayn Rand's For the New Intellectual. Again, this is a country led by an ideology, and a country that would rather perish with its ideology rather than flourish without this ideology. So don't think about the revolutionary guards as, these bored bureaucrats like the communists in Soviet Union after the 70s. No, these people take these ideas seriously, and these people are ready to die for these ideas. And you could say here, okay, I get it. This regime is kind of crazy. Okay, unusual. These people don't mind to die. What do I care? There are other crazy regimes out there. North Korea is an obvious example. Why shall we care about Iran? Just leave them aside, leave them alone to do their own things. Don't mess with them, and they won't mess with us. Except that Iran messing with other people is not like a side project that they might do every now and then when someone pokes them, when someone provokes them. Iran meddling with other countries is part of the country's identity. It's literally in their constitution. Iran meddling with other countries, Iran intervening in other countries is literally in Iran's constitution. Why? Because there's Article 154 in the Iranian constitution, which says that Iran is a supporter of the struggles of the oppressed of this world. This basically means there are some of our brothers abroad who suffer. We have a duty to help them. By the way, there's some altruism there, right? Notice the altruism there, which is also there in the Quran. There's a verse that says, quote, "The believers, men and women, are protectors of one another. They enjoin what is just and forbid what is evil," end of quote. And this is not about with they are protectors of the brothers within a country. They are protectors of the brothers anywhere. In Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in you name it, in Palestine, you name it. So the Revolutionary Guards, from the very beginning, they had a particular division which was called the Office for Liberation Movements. This was a bit like the Communist International, for those of you who know the history of the communist movement. But soon it changed its name and its title to the Quds Forces. You might have heard them recently with the death of Soleimani, the Quds Forces. What is Quds? In the local language, Quds is Jerusalem. So the Quds Forces are the forces that are expected one day to liberate Jerusalem. Till they liberate Jerusalem, they're busy though meddling in Lebanon, in helping the Shiites of Iraq, help obviously Hezbollah in Lebanon, we mentioned this, and helping Yemen. Who am I forgetting? Intervening also in Syria. So Iran trying to export the revolution is not a bug, it's a feature of the Iranian regime. And here's is one last mistake that many people make when it comes to Iran. And I made this mistake for years. So people who try to find a reason to let Iran off the hook, particularly libertarians, they say, look, most of the danger when it comes to Islamic totalitarianism or whatever comes from the Sunni Islam. Iraq are Shiites. So why bother with Iran? Let's focus on the Sunnis. Yeah, except that Iran does not only help Shiites. Who was the first VIP to visit Iran after the revolution? Yasser Arafat. Was Arafat a Shiite? No. Is Hamas in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, but not only. Is Hamas, are they predominantly Shiites? No, they're predominantly Sunni. And yet, Iran is their sponsor. Even the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sunni organization, they have an on and off relationship with Iran. So sure, Iran is engaged in a sectarian conflict with Saudi Arabia. Sure, in Yemen, they have proxy wars. But don't be mistaken that Iran supposedly only helped Shiites. Iran was a major inspiration for all the radical Muslim movements in the world in the year 1979. And for more on that, I recommend this book. It's called Black Wave by Kim Gattas. It's a book that if you have to read one book to understand the rise of modern political Islam and radical Islam, this is a very good book. So to finish, Iran is a special case. Iran is a country like no other. It's not a country, it's a country for which the goal is not wealth or material prosperity or geopolitical security, as many realists are going to claim. Well, we just need to leave Iran alone. They will have their security and that will be it. That's not what motivates Iran. Iran, again, is a country that would rather perish with its ideals and take its enemies with it, particularly Israel, and if they could, the United States, rather than flourish and live what we call a normal life without these ideals. And I will finish with the words from a commander, from an officer of the Revolutionary Guards, which will show you what Iran is about. So he says, quote, "We have two paths ahead of us. The first is martyrdom and departing for heaven. The second is victory over the enemies of Islam and establishing a government of Islamic justice. Therefore, we're not afraid of anything." What does this mean? We have two roads, death and victory. But death is also a victory. Death is also okay with us. That's why I started with the story of the human wave tactics. How did Ayn Rand put it? They don't want to live, they want you to die. Something like that. So this is not to say that Iran we should be afraid of it or that it's invincible. It means that we need to understand it and to understand that it's not a country like all others. It's a country for which ideas matter. Unfortunately, really, really, really bad ideas. We see what's happening these days with more and more people in Iran trying to rise up. Let's see what's going to happen there. Let's hope that something is going to come out of this. Okay, so many thanks. I see we have some super chat. Thank you very much, Marilyn. Marilyn asked, wasn't Iran intellectual and secular in the 50s? In the 50s and in the 60s and in the 70s. So it was secular. Now, not sure what it means intellectual, but yeah, the official, let's say, the regime was a secular regime. Now, it wasn't a regime with much freedom, but it was a secular regime. Having said that, the cleric was always very influential in Iran. And again, the revolution of 1979, when it comes to how really popular a revolution can be, it was quite popular. It had quite a participation. See if you can find in YouTube, if you are more interested in the topic, scenes from Khomeini's arrival from Paris. It's something which is it's very, very rare and very impressive to watch. Jeff, thank you very much for your contribution. Bonnie asked, is there any pro-freedom element in Iran today? Of course there is. So in 2009, there was quite an upheaval around the elections. Of course, the elections are heavily monitored, to put it lightly, by the Revolutionary Guards and their militias, which are the Basids. The legislators have to be approved by the Council of Guardians, who are mostly clerics. But yes, there is a pro-freedom element. Interestingly, Iran has many people who, particularly today, who had some contact with the West. There was possible to have social media in Iran. It has been possible. So I think the evidence shows that there is a significant percentage of the population that would be willing to rise up against the regime. So again, let's see what is happening there. But again, we're talking about a regime that takes itself seriously. I don't think we're talking about a Soviet Union in the 80s situation where everyone is kind of bored with the regime, everyone is alienated, no one takes the regime seriously. From what we see, Iran still has an important part of the population, or at least of the ruling classes, of the ruling bodies of Iran, that take the ideology of the regime seriously. So it's not so, I don't think it's going to fall so easily as it happened, I don't know, with Milosevic in Serbia, or with which other, or with the Arab Spring countries. Enric, thank you very much for your contribution. Considering Iran's ideological fervor, what could it do with nuclear weapons? And what should be done about in working to make them? I stand by what I said. Iran would rather perish with its enemies rather than living by compromising its ideology. Would you trust the people who came up with the okay, no, they didn't come up with the human wave tactic, but who used it to such extent. And would you trust the Revolutionary Guards who couldn't wait to go and become martyrs because it was a mystical spiritual experience on the road to Karbala? I wouldn't sleep very calmly at night if I were Israel or the United States and I knew that Iran had the nuclear weapons. And Francis, thank you very much, Francis. He says something nice for my beard in Greek, actually. So thank you very, very much. Okay, so this was all for today. If you appreciate the work that goes in in the daily objective, so obviously these episodes, they require a lot of prepping time, a lot of research. Oh, speaking about research, 2 books to recommend for anyone who wants to dive deeper in Iran. Again, the one is Black Wave. The other is a book called I can't show it because I have it in Kindle, Vanguard of the Imam, Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards by someone called Afson Ostovar. So Vanguard of the Imam, Religion, Politics, and Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Now, doesn't mean that I endorse ideologically these books. They're books that are historically very interesting, and they can give you a general overview on political Islam, the first, and on Iran, more specifically, the second. So if you appreciate the work that goes in these episodes, the prepping time, and the people who are behind the scenes, consider, if you like the episode, share it, like it, subscribe, all these things. So I don't see any messages in terms of other things happening today. It's Wednesday, which I think it's the day where there are the actual live meetups. So no further action today from the Ayn Rand Center UK. Thank you very much for keeping me company. Thank you very much for your contributions, for your super chats, and for your views. Bye-bye.